Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lecture for today. And before getting into handing it over to our speaker for today, I wanted to welcome you to one of the lectures from the Bible and the Ancient World series that's been sponsored by the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. I'd also like to take this time to thank the staff of the Center for Jewish Studies for supporting and helping through this talk today, particularly Chelsea White and David Wu for their help today. Joining us today for a lecture on scribes, stars, and demons in ancient Judaism and the Hellenistic Near East is Professor Annette Yoshiko Reed, who joins us today from the Scribal Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and Program in Religious Studies at New York University. After undergraduate studies at McGill University and receiving her master's degree at Harvard Divinity School and Princeton University, she received her PhD as well from Princeton University. She is a specialist in a variety of fields. Her publication list is quite extensive. She sets the bar high for future scholars in the field. She has published numerous volumes, including Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity with Cambridge, as well as Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism with Moore-Ziebeck. Her most recent book, and there are others, of course, is Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, published also with Cambridge. It's a wonderful book that I know my students have read from and engaged with, and I look forward to her future project that involves forgetting or investigates forgetting in ancient Jewish literature. Overall, she's published in leading journals of our fields, including JHJ, JSJ, JBL, a lot of J's. And her main areas of research are Second Temple Judaism, New Testament and early Christianity, as well as Jews and Christians in late antiquity. So please, again, join us today in welcoming Dr. Reed for, again, her lecture on scribes, stars, and demons in ancient Judaism and in the Hellenistic Near East. Thank you again for joining us. I wish we were here in person in Los Angeles.
Oh, likewise. I wish I was there in person too. So thank you very much, Professor Bonesho, for inviting me here. And I'm excited to share with you a bit of thoughts on my recent book, as well as thoughts forward from it. It has long been true that a major difficulty in writing the history of Judaism in the pre-Christian era is a paucity of information related directly to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Certain biblical writings were doubtlessly redacted in this age, a few others composed in it. Nevertheless, we lack a clear picture of how Judaism developed throughout this period. Rabbinic chronology radically foreshortens this era, and Josephus's brevity too reflects the poverty of historical accounts. It's not surprising then when the sources become plentiful once more after the start of the 2nd century BCE, the picture of Judaism they present differs considerably from that which can be construed for the period down to the age of Ezra and Nehemiah. Quite new forms of religious writing had emerged, as well as innovations in the history of ideas that were to set patterns for the succeeding millennia. This observation was made by Michael Stone shortly following J.T. Millick's 1976 publication of the Aramaic Enoch fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran. The discovery of these fragments yielded original Aramaic for parts of 4 of the 5 main texts that were previously known in full only from the versions within the late antique Ethiopian Compendium 1 Enoch. In 2 of the cases, moreover, the fragments revealed surprisingly early dates. Both the astronomical book and the Book of the Watchers were shown to date from before the Maccabean Revolt, likely to the 3rd century BCE, and thus before the biblical book of Daniel as well. And hence the excitement expressed by Stone. Texts associated with Enoch had long been studied as chief among the apocalypses in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. And the Book of the Watchers in particular had long been famed for its elaborate demonology, which breaks the near silence of biblical literature on the topic of demons with explicit accounts about the origins of evil spirits, the sins and fates of fallen angels, the misadventures of giants in the days before the flood. Now revealed to predate the biblical book of Daniel, the Book of the Watchers thus exemplified Stone's excitement about these manuscript finds and their potential to offer fresh clues onto what was a forgotten era in Jewish history, yet an era that had apparently seen new forms of religious writing and innovations in the history of ideas. Together with demonology, after all, the Book of the Watchers also contains an extensive angelology, including archangels with names, domains, and even personalities of their own, as well as discussions of heavenly ascent, resurrection, where the human soul abides directly after death while awaiting end-time judgment. And the book conveys this knowledge, moreover, in a new literary form that would eventually become nearly synonymous with a renaissance of Jewish interest in revelation in the centuries that followed, namely the apocalypse. What are the origins of the apocalypse, and what do we learn of its development when we no longer treat Daniel as the beginning of the story, looking instead to the Book of the Watchers? What's the place of expectations about the end time and the evolution of this genre, especially in contrast to these concerns with cosmology or heavenly ascent? And how does this all relate to what scholars of the New Testament had been studying since the 1850s as the apocalyptic ideology or worldview within Judaism that had purportedly found its culmination in the New Testament book of Revelation and in Christianity? These are some of the questions that scholars have intensively investigated in the decades immediately following Millich's publication of the Aramaic Enoch fragments and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and very much has come of it. In my time here today, however, I'd like to experiment with bringing a different set of questions to this same material, less diachronic and more synchronic, less about trajectories forward towards Christianity and more about recovering the Judaism of the 3rd century BCE, and especially its place in the Hellenistic Near East. The publication of the Aramaic Enoch fragments in the 1970s turned out to be just the beginning. What came to follow were what we now know as a whole array, if not corpus, of Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts are consistently non-sectarian and pre-sectarian, predating the Qumran community. And as John Collins thus notes, they allow us to recover a forgotten part of the literary heritage of the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE. Having access to Aramaic fragments of a book like the Book of the Watchers, then, doesn't just set the early date of one text. It gives us a whole new context in which to reread what is arguably our earliest apocalypse, situated anew now within the Aramaic literary production of its own time. The result I've suggested is significant, not just for understanding this one text or even just the history of apocalypses. It also changes how we approach Second Temple Judaism more broadly. Even today, it remains habitual to conflate the literature of the Second Temple period, and thus Old Testament pseudepigrapha and the Dead Sea Scrolls, around a set of questions predicated on a common assumption. Their significance is imagined to be intermediate or transitional, belated, in between, bridging forward. For scholars of the Hebrew Bible, this is epilogue. For scholars of the New Testament, it's prolegomenon, preparatio, or preface. And hence all the non-canonical Jewish writings composed between the Hebrew Bible and the Mishnah are commonly treated under the rubrics of what they are no longer or not yet: post-exilic, post-biblical, pre-70, pre-Christian, pre-rabbinic, intertestamental. The ramifications are perhaps nowhere more evident than in our modern scholarly treatment of a category apocalyptic. As an analytical frame, this category was designed in the 19th century to collect, compartmentalize, and compare texts and ideas around what was useful for understanding the New Testament book of Revelation, which in Greek bears the title Apocalypse. And since the late 19th century, it's often served as an abstraction used to frame questions about what comes in between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, with a space between them typically treated as if a bridge. Is apocalyptic a child of prophecy? Is it in conflict with wisdom? These are the types of questions that took form as part of late 19th century and early 20th century efforts to isolate specific parts of Judaism to serve as background to Christianity. But they've also continued to shape scholarship on Second Temple Judaism even into the 21st century. They're still embedded in our scholarly habits of what we decide to compare to what we abstract and what we specify or localize, what questions strike us as even worth asking, how we trace trajectories or trends, where we end and where we choose to begin. And thus, such habits are how we know, for instance, that to study any early apocalypse, like the Book of the Watchers, would be to compare it with earlier prophetic writings, like Ezekiel, and to later apocalypses, like Revelation, or perhaps the apocalypticism of the Jesus movement. In my most recent book, Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, I attempted to flip this approach, inverting the conventional conceptual privileging of canonical writings and asking what we might see of cultural changes in Second Temple times if we reverse the gaze, forefronting non-canonical sources instead. Taking inspiration from Stone's prescient insights, I attempted not just to fill the gaps of what we know of the 3rd century BCE, but also to experiment with seeing Second Temple Judaism anew from the purview of this lost and found era. These new and neglected data I suggested are not just footnotes onto the same old narratives. They open up alternate analytical frames and the possibility of telling new stories instead. And among what we gain in this is the opportunity to correct a habitual conflation of Second Temple literature from quite different times. More specifically, in this case, to redress the scholarly habit of reading sources from the Hellenistic period through the retrospective lenses of sources from the Roman period, including but not limited to the New Testament. There, I thus read the Book of the Watchers in relation to other Aramaic Jewish sources of likely pre-Maccabean provenance. And I attempted to situate it in relation to broader intellectual and imperial contexts in the Hellenistic Near East. In this case, especially in conversation with the recent rise of interest in that same period in the field of classics. In this, my ultimate aim, however, was to make a case for a more fine-grained approach to Jews and Judaism in Second Temple times more broadly, attending to shifts, for instance, before and after the Maccabean Revolt, as well as differences between Ptolemaic and Seleucid imperial cultures. The test case of demonology shows how such an approach can advance our understanding of significant developments during the Second Temple times. Rather than treating the beginnings of Jewish demonology as if some general post-exilic phenomenon, for instance, we may be able to situate its expressions within a specific expansion of Jewish scribal authority, articulated particularly in Aramaic, beginning in the early Hellenistic age. In my time here today, I'd like to extend my findings there so as to push this experiment a bit further. There, I focused on demonology and highlighted those shifts of knowledge and textuality that parallel or contest what we now know as the newly Hellenistic forms of Greek paideia. But what might we cull of this opportunity when we look also to what might be distinctive about Judaism in the era and thereafter dropped or forgotten or lost? This is what I'd like to explore in what follows, drawing also on my current book project, which revisits the rupture in the reception of Second Temple Judaism as part of a broader Jewish cultural history of forgetting. If Stone is correct about our renewed capacity to recover Judaism in the 3rd century BCE, what might we also recover of a synchronic purview onto the texts of this period, seen apart from anachronistic ideas about apocalyptic, but also seen apart from the implied diachrony of even rubrics like beginning and demonology as well. In what ways did Judaism change in the early Hellenistic age, a clearly fertile but frustratingly shrouded era of Jewish history between the conquests of Alexander the Great on the one hand and the Maccabean Revolt on the other? This same era has been heralded by classicists and historians of science as a watershed moment in the intellectual history of the West. Among scholars of Jewish studies, however, it has been largely neglected. The 3rd century BCE, of course, is perhaps best known for marking the beginning of the translation of the Torah and other Jewish scriptures into Greek for an increasingly flourishing Greek-speaking Jewish community in Ptolemaic Egypt. But even the celebrated origins of the so-called Septuagint have been largely compartmentalized, consistent with long-standing habits of bifurcating Hellenism from Judaism and assuming thus that Hellenistic Judaism has less to tell us about Judaism per se. We know that Judea was dominated by the Ptolemies for about a century prior to its conquest by the Seleucids. Nevertheless, as Stone already notes, the period has a surprisingly minor place in those primary sources traditionally used to reconstruct Jewish history, such as the writings of Josephus, and is also largely erased from rabbinic and later Jewish cultural memory as well. If anything, the whole period of Ptolemaic and Seleucid rule in the land of Israel is retrospectively reduced in memory to the remembrance of Antiochus IV and the Maccabean Revolt, recast in later Jewish memory, including the celebration of Hanukkah, as if the culmination of some purportedly inevitable conflict between Jews and Greeks, Judaism and Hellenism. Here as elsewhere, however, new evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls is transformative. It doesn't just fill gaps in our knowledge of Jewish history, but it opens up whole new vistas onto the Jewish past. These manuscript finds included an unprecedented wealth of pre-Maccabean materials and radically expanded our evidentiary basis for Jews and Judaism during the Hellenistic period. But it also raises new questions, thus, about what Hellenization and Hellenism even meant for Jews, Judea, and Judaism. In this regard, the use of Aramaic may be especially telling. Why not write in either Hebrew or in Greek? Older scholarship on Second Temple Judaism tended to dramatize the choice between these two languages, as if a choice between traditionalism and assimilation. And indeed, even today, even the Septuagint is sometimes treated as a concession of sorts, as if needed to protect the Judaism of diaspora Jews against the temptations of assimilating to Hellenism. But the choice of some Jews to write in the new prestige language of Greek and to translate the Torah from Hebrew into Greek does look a bit different now when we triangulate it with what we know of the use of Aramaic as well. During the Hellenistic period, Jews were not merely negotiating some binary choice between Hebrew and Greek, let alone between Judaism and Hellenism. Some were also repurposing Aramaic into a Jewish literary language, textualizing yet another cosmopolitan horizon of knowledge and expertise, cast not westward towards the nostalgia of Athens, but rather eastward toward Mesopotamia. By Devor de Mont's count, there were portions of 121 Aramaic manuscripts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This constitutes roughly 13% of the total manuscripts found in the caves at Qumran. 32 of them are too fragmentary to assess, another 5 too fragmentary to assess meaningfully. But what remains then are 84 scrolls from 29 different works, only 3 of which were known prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's much about these works that remains debated, and many of the manuscripts are actually so fragmentary that a precise sense of the corpus may never be quite possible. What is clear, however, is that the Hellenistic period saw a remarkable flowering of Jewish literary creativity in Aramaic, marked by new concerns with scribalism and by new ideas about the very scope of knowledge that should be taught and textualized by Jewish scribes. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars of Second Temple Judaism saw only a tiny glimpse of this creativity, and it was limited largely to what had been transmitted in translation, mainly by Christians, through apocrypha like Tobit and pseudepigrapha like 1 Enoch. With so much more data, however, we're able to see more of the context of what we see in these two texts, including the context of their interest in angels and demons. And what we see helps to situate this interest as just one part of a surprisingly expansive vision of Jewish literary production that encompasses so much more as well. Astronomy, geography, cosmology, eschatology, the calendar, the postmortem fates of humankind, and especially the deep past, antediluvian, the time before the flood, and pre-Sinaitic, the time before Moses and Sinai. And perhaps tellingly, this expansion is accompanied by a pointed self-consciousness in reflection on topics like writing, reading, books, scribes, and especially knowledge. Indeed, if our evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls offers fresh perspectives onto a forgotten era, it's in part in the opportunity to follow the concerns within the texts themselves, and thus also to notice their overlaps with contemporaneous materials from across the Hellenistic world. Their claims to totalizing knowledge, for instance, ring poignant in relation to the claims of new Hellenistic forms of Greek paideia. And their self-conscious bookishness resonates both with Ptolemaic culture politics, as best known from the Library of Alexandria, and with what Steve Johnstone notes of as inscriptional evidence for the rising prestige of books and textuality across a variety of locales in this same period. In my recent book, I focused mostly on how insights into the Hellenistic period from classicists can thus help us contextualize many of the concerns in those Aramaic Jewish sources. But for understanding the articulation of these concerns, it may also be useful to attend further to Near Eastern parallels as well. We might ask, for instance, to what degree these Aramaic Jewish sources might echo or even engage other native and indigenous responses to Hellenism, such as those we find among scribal and priestly native elites elsewhere in the Hellenistic Near East. One poignant example of this is the turn back to the deep past, as emblematized by the elevation of scribes as custodians of wisdom from before the flood, of antediluvian knowledge. We've noted, for instance, how the antediluvian sage Enoch is here credited with what becomes a rather vast array of body of knowledge and information, spanning topics ranging from angels and demons to the structure of the cosmos, the heavens, and the movements of the moon, sun, and stars. The result is an image of antediluvian wisdom and the deep past that resonates with what we see, for instance, in Berosus. Berosus is a figure who wrote in the 3rd century BCE in Seleucid Babylonia and who defended Mesopotamian scholarship by tracing its lines back to Oannes. In both, we find claims of a scribal succession of knowledge from the far distant past as unbroken, but also a defense thus of Near Eastern models of knowledge as far older and fuller than the Greek wisdom embraced by Hellenistic elites. Long before the Greeks even knew how to write, let alone the Macedonians, Berosus claims that Babylonian scribes actually knew and wrote everything. And through Enoch, Jews make much the same claim. To be sure, an interest in antediluvian wisdom is longstanding in Mesopotamia, but it does mark a significant shift in Jewish literary cultures. Genesis, after all, is actually quite terse in its treatment of the time before the flood. But the gaps that it leaves thus become opportunities for new literary creativity in Aramaic Jewish texts like the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Giants, and Genesis Apocryphon. In addition, other Aramaic Jewish texts, such as Aramaic Levi, the Admonitions of Kahat, and Visions of Amram, trace these lines forward, evoking an unbroken succession of Jewish knowledge and writing stretching back to before the flood. Much of what we see in this Aramaic Jewish literature thus recalls what Alan Lindsay has observed of the Uruk list of kings and sages in relation to the Seleucid era redeployment of older traditions about Apkallu. Lindsay characterizes Hellenistic Uruk as marked by a rise of antiquarianism, whereby Mesopotamian scholars systematized older received traditions to speak to the new circumstances of Hellenistic rule. What's significant for our purposes are the results, which include an explicit articulation of what he calls a mythology of scribal succession. Indeed, what Lindsay observes of Hellenistic Uruk could be said no less of Hellenistic Judea as we see it through the lens of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. Here too, we find a mythology of scribal succession alongside a scribal renaissance of archaic indigenous lore. And here too, its agents may be scribes, who felt a need now to reassert their importance. It's certainly a challenge to reorient our sense of Hellenization and Hellenism to speak to a Hellenistic era Judaism multilingually expressed in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. But I suggest that this challenge comes with some opportunities as well, including the opportunity to situate Jews and Judaism further in relation to the Hellenistic Near East. And in some cases, such situating may aid us in solving some long-standing puzzles, perhaps not limited to the puzzle of the beginnings of Jewish demonology. John Collins, for instance, once quipped that the post-exilic period has been treated like the Sheol of ancient civilizations, where the myths and ideas of an earlier period led a shadowy afterlife, enjoying vitality only insofar as they were reincarnated in Jewish apocalyptic. Based on older understandings of Hellenism, Judaism, and apocalyptic, this pattern struck scholars as very strange. But if anything, it only confirmed what they already thought of a fundamental strangeness of apocalyptic literature. After all, why would Jews faced with Hellenism look back to the sorts of ideas that we associate with the ancient Near East? Here too, however, new evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls is useful not just for filling gaps, but also opening up new frames, new purviews, and new perspectives. Looking back onto Second Temple times from our present, it might be tempting to focus on those developments that later became significant within Judaism and Christianity as we now know them. And hence our temptation to relegate the ancient Near East to the background of the Bible, while focusing more on Hellenism when we consider later periods of Judaism in relation to Christianity. But to the degree that Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls enable a more synchronic approach to the early Hellenistic age, what they show us is the continued vitality translocally of Mesopotamian scholarship as an inspiration for some learned Jews, and perhaps especially as the locus for this new antiquarianism, drawing on a shared scribal renaissance of archaic indigenous lore. This pattern has been noted in a number of specialist studies of individual Aramaic Jewish texts. Henrik Dravnell, for instance, has posited Mesopotamian metrology and the Aramaic Levi document, as well as tracing its debts to didactic models of Babylonian scholarship, as shared also with the Aramaic forms of the astronomical book. Kelly Koblenz-Bosch has mapped the geography of the Book of the Watchers as a hybridization of Greek as well as Babylonian ideas about the earth. And perhaps most extensively now, Matthew Goff has shown how the Jewish engagement with the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Qumran Book of the Giants actually goes well beyond the mere mention of his name. Far from just polemical, moreover, Goff suggests that this is an exercise in creative adaptation of Gilgamesh motifs. The dynamic that Goff finds in the Qumran Book of the Giants may be especially useful then for understanding the apparent debts to Near Eastern myth within early apocalypses like the Book of the Watchers and Daniel. Their connections might be best explained not as some idiosyncratic feature of apocalyptic, but rather in terms of the concerns common to the Aramaic Jewish literature of the time. If we glimpse some response to their new Hellenistic cultural contexts and empires, it's not so much through imperial resistance, at least initially. It's rather through this scribal renaissance of archaic indigenous lore, which in this case reconfigures even what counts as native or indigenous. Might we see this dynamic then elsewhere as well? In the time remaining, I'd like to explore this question with a focus on two other topics that are prominent in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, but came to be later forgotten within Judaism, namely astronomy and exorcism. From a modern perspective, these two topics might seem as far apart as science is to magic and just as irrelevant to religion. But part of what I'd like to explore are the connections that we might see when we consider them instead from within our ancient sources, situated synchronically with an eye to the Hellenistic Near East. It seems likely, of course, that earlier Israelite scribes reflected upon the cosmos and studied its cycles. What they do not seem to have done, however, is to write about these topics in any explicit terms. Or, as Yonatan Ben Dov puts it, they did not seem to have composed complete treatises dedicated to systematic scientific genres. Yet this is precisely what we find evinced very densely and decisively in the Aramaic Jewish literature of the early Hellenistic age, perhaps beginning already with its seemingly earliest exemplars. Even prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the astronomical book was known to modern scholars as chapters 72 to 82 of the Ethiopian compendium 1 Enoch. In the form that we know it there, it offers a first-person account of the antediluvian sage Enoch concerning what the angel Uriel showed him of the cycles of the moon, sun, stars, seasons, and weather, and what Enoch in turn wrote and taught of this knowledge to and through his son Methuselah. The Aramaic Enoch fragments, however, make clear that this narrative only emerged at the end of a redactional process, into which they give us some rare glimpses as well. The earliest related fragment, 4Q208, seems to attest a tradition of Aramaic Jewish pedagogy that used didactic lists to teach topics such as lunar visibility, largely along Mesopotamian models. Later fragments like 4Q209 attest a process of narrativization with the addition of first-person notices to such lists, thereby evoking their transmission in a context of scribal instruction. It is this narrativization in terms that finds its culmination in what we now see in 1 Enoch 72 to 82. There, the didactic lists have been a bit compressed, and the text focuses instead about the story of what Enoch learned from the angel Uriel, which is recast now from scribal pedagogy, from moments of teachings, into his heavenly journey. This, however, was not the only trajectory of development, as we know now from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the calendrical and related materials found there. In a seminal study of these materials, Yonatan ben Dov established that the ancient Jewish engagement with Babylonian astronomy was much more sustained than previously imagined. And since then, scholars like Eshbal Ratzon have shown that their connections may be even closer than even ben Dov had thought. Inasmuch as their findings point to the intellectual interchange with Mesopotamia, as well as with Hellenistic traditions, they thus dispel the mirage of a monolithic Judaism in conflict with the monolithic Hellenism in Second Temple times. At the very least, the astronomical book and other technical materials from Qumran thus showcase an entire facet of ancient Jewish intellectual culture that is almost wholly lacking from the Hebrew Bible and almost wholly lost to later Rabbinic Judaism. And this, in my view, has significant consequences for our understanding of Hellenistic era shifts in Judaism, as well as Second Temple Judaism more broadly. Whether or not this knowledge was newly embraced by Jewish scribes at the time or had been long taught and is just being textualized into new forms, it remains significant. From the Aramaic fragments of the astronomical book, it's clear that the emergence of newly explicit textualized concern for astronomy, after all, involved a process of reframing lists into literature, but also the repackaging of Babylonian knowledge as Jewish knowledge. These are epistemological shifts, but they're also literary acts, and framed, moreover, by a projection back into a Jewish past that is thereby rewritten as a scribal past, as an antediluvian heritage that could be passed from Moses in scribal succession, or from Enoch in scribal succession towards Moses. In translating scribal lists into Jewish literature, moreover, the scribes responsible for the astronomical book also engaged in practices akin to Babylonian scribes like Berosus, the surviving fragments of whom focus a lot on king lists, but seem to include some astronomical materials as well. And at the same time, these Jewish scribes are engaging in an anthological project that's notably parallel to that of some Greek intellectuals of their own time as well. The 3rd century BCE is famous as an intensive era of imperial patronage of science, especially by the early Ptolemies. And this patronage sparked popular interest in the stars in particular, as we see most famously in Aratus's reworking of astronomical traditions, which notably is a reworking of older traditions into didactic poetry. Here's, as elsewhere, however, part of the value of looking at any such parallels is to bring each element into sharper relief. These Jewish claims to knowledge about the moon, sun, and stars, for instance, may be cosmopolitan in character, but their aim is to elevate Jewish scribalism and knowledge in particular, and they actually do so in quite distinctive ways. This dynamic is perhaps most explicit in Pseudo-Eupolemus, who wrote in Greek around the 2nd century BCE, and who may have known some form of the astronomical book. What he asserts here is that the Jews are actually the ones who invented astronomy, and thus who are responsible for the teachings about the stars that other people now study as well, including Greeks, Egyptians, and even the Babylonians. What he asserts, though, that Jewish knowledge about the cosmos still remains unique by virtue of a special connection between scribes and the very angels who govern the order of the celestial revenue. What is explicit in Pseudo-Eupolemus may be implicit already in the astronomical book as well. Astronomy may have a cross-cultural value, but this cross-cultural value is important for these scribes insofar as it can make a claim about Jewish scribes as uniquely close to and likened to the angels. The cases of antediluvian wisdom and astronomy, moreover, may help us to look at developments in demonology from a new perspective, including with an eye to what the very notion of demonology might elide. Here, too, we find the explicit embrace of a topic virtually neglected in the Hebrew Bible. Within earlier biblical literature, one does find some terms related to names that are associated with demons elsewhere in the Near East, and some angels and other figures, such as Hasatan, take on figures adversarial to Israel. What we don't find in the Hebrew Bible, however, is any sense of these transmundane powers as a topic for concerted literary exploration, nor as a primary domain of Jewish scribal pedagogy or priestly expertise. If anything, expertise of this sort is figured as foreign and dangerous. By all accounts, then, the Book of the Watchers marks the earliest attestation of a systematic Jewish discourse about transmundane powers in general and about the hostile ones in particular. The Book of the Watchers includes cosmological knowledge similar to that of the astronomical book, albeit with a more capacious scope, spanning geography and oceanography, as well as the various powers that traverse between them, both hostile and heavenly, what we call angels and demons. It thus includes explanations of the origins, nature, and fate of evil spirits, and these explanations form part of a surprisingly sophisticated account of transmundane powers, which outlines the proper roles and domains of spirits in contrast to flesh, as well as mapping the spaces overseen by specific archangels and the places of the imprisonment of wayward watchers and their eschatological judgment. It is in this broader context that we find its most famous tale, the tale about the fallen angels, which includes the descent of 200 watchers, their desire for human women, their teaching of corrupting arts, and their paternity of monstrous giants who tormented humankind in the days before the flood and polluted the earth and hybrid flesh until the purification of flood, and as evil spirits haunting humankind thereafter. Some scholars, such as Paolo Sacchi and Gabriele Boccaccini, have read the fallen angels of the Book of the Watchers as part of a broadly post-exilic theological concern with the problem of evil. Thanks to new evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, we can see now that its approach to transmundane powers didn't simply spring from biblical interpretation or elite theological debate, but also, and perhaps primarily, from an acutely felt sense of malevolent forces as active in everyday lives. To write order upon evil spirits in the early Hellenistic age was not just to speculate about good and evil. It was to root one's authority in a claim to local expertise about those spirits, who are commonly believed to intervene in the lives, fates, and bodies of human individuals. This is part of the context that we're now newly able to recover due to other evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which includes fragments that speak to practical efforts among ancient Jews to combat demonic forces in their everyday lives. This evidence includes some plausibly pre-sectarian materials in both Aramaic and Hebrew, such as 4Q560 and 11Q11, as well as related materials composed within the Qumran community a bit later. Taken all together, the sources serve to remind us of the local circulation of ideas about evil spirits outside of literary, elite, and exegetical contexts, while also pointing us to new trends in their textualization. Attention to such sources then can help to pinpoint the innovation of the Book of the Watchers, not as the beginning of a Jewish belief in demons, but rather as a scribal Jewish engagement in the more abstractified second-tier practices of collecting, classifying, and integrating information about them. That is, demonology as distinct from demon belief. And is this sense that we might liken what we see in the Book of the Watchers to what we see in the astronomical book in relation to lunar and other didactic lists. The Book of the Watchers not only collects, textualizes, and narrativizes demon beliefs, it simultaneously scribalizes them. And here too, it may not be accidental that the image that results of the ideal Jewish scribe looks a lot more like a Mesopotamian scholar than like a Greek intellectual. Evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls may point to the distinctively Hellenistic contexts of our earliest known textual expressions of demonology. But they thus challenge us also to rethink this context apart from older models that bifurcate the Near Eastern context of ancient Israel on the one hand from the Hellenistic context of Second Temple Judaism on the other. Seen through the lens of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what seemed to be an either-or question now appears to be a case of exploring the spaces both and. In this regard, it's intriguing that the two earliest known Jewish narratives about exorcism also appear in Aramaic texts from the same period, both attested among the Dead Sea Scrolls as well, namely Tobit from the 3rd century BCE and Genesis Apocryphon from perhaps the 2nd. As in the case of astronomy, the attestation of exorcism in Aramaic may not be coincidental. It may point us to some overlooked dynamics in the circulation of knowledge across the Hellenistic Near East. On the basis of his triangulation of Mesopotamian magic, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and later Aramaic incantation bowls, for instance, Chaim Biro has proposed an Aramaic cultural mediation of Mesopotamian scholasticism in the case of exorcism, similar to what Ben Dove had posited for astronomy. If Biro is correct, it's possible that the exorcistic expertise could have played some part in Aramaic Jewish pedagogy of this time, alongside calendrical astronomy and antediluvian history. In my recent book, I'd looked mainly to exorcism to illuminate the literary discourses about transmundane powers that I analyzed there in terms of demonology. In the time since its publication, however, I've begun to think a bit more about what this choice of terms and framing might elide. It was certainly helpful for engaging cross-cultural research by David Frankfurter and others, who've pointed to the differences between local demon beliefs on the one hand and demonology in the sense of their systemization and textualization on the other. Nevertheless, it still remains it's impossible to speak of demonology without also implying some difference from angelology. And it's not entirely clear whether just this difference can be found within the sources themselves. We certainly have ample evidence for a surge of Jewish interest in transmundane powers in the Hellenistic period, not just in Aramaic, but in Hebrew and Greek as well. Texts like the Book of the Watchers, Jubilees, 11Q11, and the Songs of the Sage certainly list, name, theorize transmundane powers. But what they do not do is order them into an overarching binary system that is akin to what we think of as angels versus demons. It is because of this lack of polarization, for instance, that Benny Reynolds thus suggests that we might want to use a term like demigods to describe all such entities during most stages of Israelite and Jewish religion, even during Hellenistic times. And if so, what Anne Marie Kitt's notes of ancient Israel might remain true even into Hellenistic times as well. It might be good to be cautious about our own presumptions that a demon is intrinsically evil and an angel is intrinsically good. When I was writing my book, for instance, I just followed the common scholarly habit of analyzing the Jewish literary discourse about transmundane powers in terms of angels and demons, as clear from the title of my book. Although I did treat the two as connected, it remains I still distinguish them. What I did not notice then that I would want to think about more now is what these two terms thus reinscribe, namely the notion that the Second Temple period was marked by increasing polarization in the idea of transmundane powers and the world of the cosmos. If the notion of polarization, the separation of good and evil, remains oddly pervasive, it may be in part because of our debts in scholarship to much older scholarly ideas about Jewish apocalyptic as related to Persian dualism. Long prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the rise of Jewish interest in angels and demons had been explained as a result of Persian influence, which was often described since Wilhelm Busset in the 19th century as some kind of corrupting or degrading foreign force impacting Israel's monotheism during the period of Achaemenid Persian rule, the empire directly prior to Alexander. To be sure, the main evidence cited was pretty sparse. It was mainly specific demon names in Tobit, like Asmodeus, but also kind of a sense of a presumed dualism in what was imagined as an apocalyptic worldview. What has been striking, however, as John Collins has shown, is the degree to which the Dead Sea Scrolls have not borne out this old theory at all. Recently, moreover, New Testament scholars like Giovanna Bazzana have even pointed to the surprising lack of such polarization, even in the New Testament Gospels. Even there, Bazzana suggests, it's not as useful to talk about demons and angels, but rather to point to how the conditions corrected by exorcism are described in much the same terms as the positive sense of spirit possession that we're accustomed to describing in other terms like indwelling or inspiration. Recently, I found something similar in my efforts to extend my inquiries into Jewish demonology into Septuagintal texts and other Greek materials of the time. I was actually quite surprised that even Greek terms like daimones there do not really fit with what we call demons. Like other spirits, rather, daimones are still indeterminate or oscillate or take up different functions, often at the behest of the divine. I didn't go into the question of Persian influence in my book, but I will say now that it might be worth taking seriously how the evidence of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls points to the distinctively Hellenistic context of our earliest known textualization of Jewish demonology, but also to the enduring impact of Mesopotamian traditions instead. There are certainly earlier traditions reworked in these Hellenistic texts, but especially if we follow Biro, Babylon seems to loom larger than Persia. Furthermore, if anything, what we like to call angels and demons and distinguish as such in polarization seems to remain in these texts a subset of older ideas about spirits. In fact, the representation of such spirits in Jewish literature of the Hellenistic period is surprisingly akin to what scholars such as Kitz describe as biblical ruchot and their Near Eastern counterparts. These spirits are not inherently good or evil, as much as they are tasked with actions that benefit or harm humankind. In the Hellenistic period, of course, some spirits began to take on personalities of their own, have their own stories, names, feelings. And some even might act independently of God, as most famously in the case of the fallen angels. The question remains then whether these spirits and those responsible, for instance, for illness or adjured through exorcism, are acting against the will of God. It is interesting, however, that this became enough of a question for Jews in the Hellenistic period that we can see the care with which books like Jubilees address it. In any case, what may be worth asking is whether we should be following their own categories here instead of imposing our own. When we do, we might not see angels and demons in a separate sense, but what we do see is the rise of Jewish scribal interest in astronomy and exorcism as not as strange a pairing as we might think. Notwithstanding modern notions of apocalyptic as an escape from this world into the supernatural, for instance, our earliest apocalypses actually discuss spirits in a sense that's quite natural. And to read them as part of this Aramaic literature of their own time is thus to question, too, the bifurcation of natural and supernatural as well. Much more analysis is needed in these terms. But even a preliminary glimpse suggests a sense of spirits that's at the very least far from supernatural. In the Book of the Watchers, for instance, much the same term as spirit is used for wind, and these are also marked as a domain of scribal knowledge and wisdom. There are winds that move the celestial cycles, and the heavens are structured around their gates. As already in the astronomical book, thus, angels are no less natural than supernatural as well. And notably, too, the same cluster of terms around the words spirit and wind is also used to describe what survives of the individual human after the death of their bodies. And thus, even if we might think of astronomy as world apart from exorcism, eschatology, and the afterlife, it might be worth asking if Jewish scribes at the time demarcated their sense of knowledge in different ways. When they claim expertise, after all, it is foremost over these overlapping domains of the unseen, the winds above and their heavenly gates, the spirits that help or harass humankind, the ultimate fates of our spirits, too. Among what the Dead Sea Scrolls permits us to recover then from historical loss is an astonishing expansion in the scope and self-consciousness of Jewish textual production in the early Hellenistic age. Perhaps not coincidentally, its range seems to answer the totalizing claims of Greek paideia, especially in the forms that the style of enculturating education was coming to define elite identity in Hellenistic empires. Yet, as we have seen, it would be misleading to reduce this move to the contrast of Hellenism and Judaism. The very choice to repurpose Aramaic into a Jewish literary language, after all, points to a creative reconfiguration of what even counts as indigenous lore and local knowledge, far more complex than simply the preservation of some statically authentic Israelite heritage against imperial encroachment. And so too with the textualization of Mesopotamian knowledge in new Jewish forms. To the degree that the advent of Hellenistic rule brought new questions, new concerns, and new challenges, some Jewish scribes answered them from and with a scribal renaissance of archaic indigenous lore, predicated on a new mythology of scribal succession. And in the process, they forged new models of teaching textuality and knowledge out of older Israelite and Near Eastern materials. The result was a new vision of Jewish learning, which would become largely lost to Jewish memory, but which would nevertheless persist on in echoes, including in many of the innovations in the history of ideas that were to set the patterns for succeeding millennia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for an excellent lecture today. Just a quick note, if you have questions, please provide them in the chat, and I will be compiling them and asking them when they arise. Thank you so much. My students will know that, of course, I'll be waiting for questions. I might ask one of my own. I'm thinking in particular about this notion of what you've described as kind of like we did it first and we did it best, as compared to other Hellenistic or other texts that would claim that other groups did it first or are the owners of such knowledge. And I see this as continuing beyond these texts. So I'm thinking in particular of Philo's discussions of Moses and philosophy, and even in rabbinic traditions of Roman holidays in my own research that I find. This idea that we did it first, it's based in our knowledge, and even while admitting to accessing and using the other group's knowledge. So is this something that you also see as continuing beyond these Aramaic writings of the 3rd century and later?
Yeah, I think it's actually an interesting example where, at least in the Aramaic writings and Greek writings that seem to know them, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's intriguing about this, is that we do find this kind of interest in first finders. I mean, it's true of the Hellenistic age in general from the 4th century. Also in Greek, there's this new concern, like who did what first? You see it a little bit already in Herodotus, but it becomes this kind of notion of like compiling lists of like, who was the first to X? Who was the first to Y? And there's a way in which, it's interesting to see Jews kind of insert themselves into these stories or into these claims, even as they're also using those claims to do work in inner Jewish terms. And I think, we see it continue. The Greek Jewish versions that, some of which seem to draw on Aramaic traditions, eventually, like they are picked up by Josephus, by Philo, by early Christians, from Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius. So it does have like a very lengthy line forward, as well as being part of the way that, especially after the Hellenistic, during and after the Hellenistic period, like different cultures interact with each other. Like, I think what's interesting is, when you look at the Greek language materials, it's like people, it's like Egyptians and the Ptolemaic Empire, Babylonians and the Seleucid Empire are kind of, have a competitive historiography. And then, Jewish materials kind of lace between those two and I think that's part of what makes it, it's possible to outlive those empires.
Thank you. So we have a question from Miriam Stryker Hurt, and she asks, can you elaborate on the way in which Jubilees addresses exorcism and the question of whether exorcism goes against the will of God?
Thank you. It's a great question. I liked how I did my, I love the Book of Jubilees, so I'm grateful that you asked about it, because in a lot of ways, if you look at the Aramaic Jewish material of this time, it like raises all these questions. And then you look at Jubilees, like it is written in the Hasmonean period in Hebrew. But one of the things it does, it tries to answer a number of these questions. So one of the things it does is it has these kinds of it has a double perspective. So the book is about the perspective, it's written kind of from the perspective of the angel of the presence, who's always talking in the first person to Moses. And he has this kind of big world perspective, what everything looks like from heaven. And from heaven, there is no injustice. I mean, there's actually a quote from Jubilees: there is no injustice. All evil spirits are ultimately under God's control. That God actually took them, he actually imprisoned all of them. And then one of the angels, Mastema, came and said, "Oh, is it a good idea to imprison all of them? Because it's actually not so bad to have some demons, kind of help out in terms of punishing humankind. So keep some, and I'll just keep control of them." So there's this grand plan, and there is no problem with demonology. There is no exorcism. There is no case of there being a threat to the completeness of divine power. So that's what it says on that high level. But at the same time, it has these really poignant accounts of individual prayers of patriarchs, especially Noah, but others as well, Abraham, in which one of the things that they talk about is this kind of anxiety about demons, and this anxiety about this case is like, how do you combat them? So it's a very interesting, it's incredibly fascinating text in that regard. But in terms of how you combat them, what they put out is a cases like the exiting of how you get demons out of your body is mainly what we might call medicine. So one of the angels gives this big book to Moses, to Noah, and says like, use this book, and it has basically all these recipes. And some of it is kind of, you might think of like magical recipes, some of which we think of as medicine. But what it will do is it will make sure that you can kind of drive these demons away. So the idea there is very much like this, notion you would gather, plants and stuff like that, and that's how you would do it. So
this idea of Noah as the first doctor.
Oh, right? Yeah. And that idea survives into Byzantium. You have medicinal books associated with Noah. So.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat? Oh, okay. Another one from Megan Remington. So she asks, in the context of Jewish communities under empire, how helpful is it to think about the use of Aramaic and scribal innovation upon Mesopotamian tradition as a type of subversion of Greek scribes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's helpful, in part because I feel like what we're seeing is a kind of triangulation. So I think not necessarily of Greek scribes, I would say, but of this kind of entire new model of Greek education. So, this case of paideia, meaning like through Greek literate education, this like encircling education, that non-Greeks kind of can become Greek. So like this, and whether or not Jews, some Jews engaged in this kind of education, we know most extensively for Philo, but even if they didn't, they had a sense of eliteness as defined by a certain kind of education. And so I think it's interesting that concerns of education and this kind of like counter paideia become really richly articulated in this period, both in Aramaic and then in Hebrew, first in Aramaic before in Hebrew, I mean, seemingly, but, both in Aramaic and in Hebrew, but this idea that you have a similar view of like the person made by education. So I think it is interesting to look at it in that way. But again, I think there's some ways in which you can say there's a shared concern versus the articulation of that concern. And I think the kind of Greek parallels really help us with the shared concerns.
Well, one thing, if the more questions come up, I'm happy to ask them. But I think one thing that your work does so well is push back against this notion of a monolithic Hellenism in the Second Temple period, and also especially in regard to language use and knowledge. It's quite frustrating, at least as a scholar of Aramaic, to see these ideas. Oh, once Alexander comes, everything's Greek, and to showcase that Aramaic continues on. We have less evidence of it, but it definitely continues on. There is still the apparatus in many ways of that Persian Aramaic tradition that I think is more prevalent than has previously been understood. So thank you.
No, I think a lot of those questions are really like it's some of it is, I mean, it's always surprising sometimes how long certain 19th century kind of founding principles of the field, how they really sometimes just set questions, but they also set how scholars are trained.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're a scholar of Second Temple period and you're like, or rabbinics for that matter, I want to learn Greek. It's really easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
To say like, oh no, I want to learn like Persian Imperial Aramaic, like that's actually harder. I mean, just like kind of in the just practical, even just a sense of like finding the class. I mean, now they fear people, but it's, there are very few places to be able to go for graduate school that you can get that. Mm-hmm. But you can take summer Greek anywhere you want to. But I think there's this kind of way in which this is why I often think of in terms of habits. Like it's not necessarily assumptions. It's just we get into there's certain habits that are pretty long-standing. And also this kind of dramatic sense of Hellenism and Judaism is one of them. We can disprove it all the time, but people love it.
Actually, and this actually is a really good transition because I'm teaching a class on Aramaic at Elephantine and at Qumran next quarter. So, so students, make sure to enroll in that. But it's really the other thing, and again, if there's more questions, I'm happy to ask them. But I also really appreciate your discussion earlier about I think the putting Second Temple Judaism either with the before or with the after, seeing it as a period of transition, and not something that is of its own. And I think we see this, as you said, in the habits, as you said, of scholarship, of teaching, and even in our various institutions, like the awards of SBL. There's a Bible one, there's a New Testament one, but there's very little explicit discussion of this really foundational and important period. So thank you. Another question by Martin Klepner is, why and how did the Hellenic Hellenic influence and learning among Jews get rejected, leading to the Maccabean Revolt?
Yes, that's a big question that people have been just debating since, at least since Elias Vickerman and Cherikover many decades ago. I think part of the question is, I think part of the interesting thing about the Maccabean Revolt is that some elements of Greekness get rejected, such as the idea of the establishment of Jerusalem as a polis, like as a Greek style city-state, and also certain kinds of education, especially like the gymnasia, the education. So those things get rejected by some priests and others and embraced by some priests and others. But at the same time, other elements of Hellenism become quite embraced. So, I mean, it's one of these things, I mean, it's a kind of example of, by the time you've gotten that far in to a period of Hellenistic empires, it becomes it becomes very difficult to reject Hellenism writ large. And it's more of a case in terms of sometimes some symbolic elements become rejected by certain figures. And this is, this has been something people have discussed a lot with the Maccabean Revolt itself, as well as the Hasmonean dynasty founded after, which the case is it's supposed to be anti-Hellenistic, but it's actually, it's shaped like a Hellenistic rulership. So it becomes very, very complex. I mean, you can think of it even if we think about the ways that cultural influence works, today. Like if we were trying to take Americanness out of, let's say, American Judaism, it becomes incredibly hard. Like certain things can represent it, but it's kind of like the joke people tell about the frog asking the fish, saying to the fish, like, oh, the water is good today. And the fish says like, oh, what's water? By the 2nd century, it's become incredibly pervasive. So even when people are rejecting elements of Hellenism, they're doing it by adopting other elements of Hellenism.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay, Dr. Reed. Okay. It's from Megan Remington. She says, I loved hearing your reflections on your last book and the categories you employed. Have you decided yet on a new set of terms besides transmundane powers?
This has been my struggle this whole time. Because I mean, it's an interesting case. It's like, you have this challenge, it's interesting, like our whole way, especially in academic speech, of thinking about knowledge assumes there is a difference between supernatural and natural. It also assumes there's some kind of very particular Christian categories, things that develop in medieval Christianity that just kind of come into English like so solidly. I mean, you can talk about like demonology or so forth. Everyone knows what you're talking about, that they assume this is like evil, like with a big E, Transmundane powers is very clunky. I use it a lot. For some reason, demigod strikes me as not quite, I don't know, there's something about that kind of bugs me, but I may try to think about it because Benny Reynolds has made a good case for that. My temptation might be to start actually using spirits as a category. This is one of the things I went through every reference to daimones in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, in the order of the individual, like the chronology of the kind of individual texts as they were translated. And one of the things that really comes clear is that, what Philo says, Philo basically says like daimones, which is this one word that's sometimes translated demons, angeloi, this one word that's translated as angels. He's like, oh, those things are the same, and they're actually spirits, pneumata. And it's interesting because his comment there that he makes in the 1st century, when you think about it, it's like actually his description seems to really reflect what we see in our sources too, is that at least the Jewish sources really use this whole kind of language of spirits. Spirits and winds as actually being the same thing, spirits and winds and souls. If in Jubilees in particular, it's like you can go through and it's like all over the place and surprisingly systematic. And even in the Book of the Watchers, when they're trying to explain like why, what's wrong with what the fallen angels did? What's wrong with it? they explain it in terms of there's a difference between spirits and flesh. So flesh, if you're flesh and you want immortality, you get it through reproduction. You have kids. If you're spirits, you don't engage in that kind of immortality, but you have immortality of like heavenly realms. So they have this real like system. So I mean, it's an interesting question. I've often thought like maybe I should actually just embrace the word spirit and try to follow it like where it goes, instead of like coming up with my own weird transmitting power category. It's interesting those times though, where our language in some ways is in the way of us describing what's going on in our texts. And I think I find those situations fascinating. So thanks for picking up on that as a kind of something to think with.
Yes, Megan says she could get on the spirits train.
Yeah, it is. I don't know, this book by Giovanni Bazzana called Having the Spirit of Christ, that's about exorcism in the New Testament, is actually quite, I mean, if you have a chance, you should read it if you can, because it's one of the cases he makes, and also looking at cross-cultural examples of exorcism, is that, you know, this idea of inspiration or indwelling of the spirit, including the spirit, is not really as distinguished as you think it would be from the idea of like the problem solved by exorcism. So you could have harmful or helpful spirits, but it's all kind of imagined the same, which also makes you think like, actually, if we looked at those things together, instead of assuming like they're completely separate phenomena, like what do we see? Inspiration and like the state that needs exorcism, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to do there, so.
Thank you so much for your lecture today, Dr. Reed. It was a pleasure to have you here remotely at UCLA, and I hope that we can have you again.
Yeah, I wish I was there enjoying the weather.
But thank you again. I know that my students have benefited supremely from your work in many ways, and even the more so today. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.